I'm Seamless. And today I'm going to talk to you about Sytrus and why it's awesome, and a little bit about how FM works. I'm going to try not to focus too much on how the super science of FM, because I talked about that until I'm blue in the face, and I've only got not enough time to become blue in the face. So we're going to sort of scoot on past that, and then we'll talk about the things that make Sytrus rather unique and why I say that Sytrus is the best FM synth available as a digital synth. So if for some reason you've never heard the term FM synthesis before, FM in this case stands for frequency modulation, which is the idea that we're changing the pitch of an oscillator really, really fast. So if I have Sytrus over here, and you see this matrix configuration, this is pretty much how every FM synth is going to have something like this. FM8 has a slightly different way of doing it, but it's still the same basic idea. And it's all based on how the Yamaha DX7 works. And in fact, Sytrus and FM8 and things like that can load DX7 patches. If you have the sysx files, you can just put them in there, and it'll give you the same patch that you would have gotten out of the DX7. But for this to work, the idea is that you're using another oscillator as kind of like an LFO that can go into audio rate territory. And LFO versus audio rate, LFO stands for low frequency oscillation, so you're oscillating slowly enough that you're not really hearing a tone, you're hearing individual motion. And then audio rate was sort of the opposite of that, where you're going so fast that you can't detect a tone. Obviously, there's kind of merging between the two of them. You can make an LFO kind of go fast enough that's a note, and you can also just play something low enough that it sounds like it's an LFO. The digital FM is particularly important because in the analog world, when you FM something, you just FM an oscillator by another oscillator, and then it's just going to do it, and you don't have to worry about it. But in the digital world, for reasons that are lost on me because I'm not a programmer or a DSP person, directly modulating parameters like pitch are kind of hard for some reason. So the way that the DX7 works is that it doesn't actually modulate pitch, it modulates phase. And we'll explain why that's special in a second. So if I play a note, and I oscillate it by a really slow tone. Yay, FM. We get a fairly predictable result. So a sine wave, it does more or less what you expect a sine wave to do. And then if I were to change it to a triangle wave, it doesn't exactly behave the way that you would think it would. In fact, it behaves more like you'd think a square wave would. And if I, in fact, used a square wave, or a saw wave, behavior that's just sort of doesn't make a lot of sense occurs. And this is entirely because of the idea that we're modulating phase. So what this means is the phase and moving it around, if you're familiar with the term the Doppler effect. The Doppler effect is where if you're standing somewhere and a source of sound is moving, if the source is moving towards you, it feels like it's getting higher in pitch. If it's moving away from you, it's getting lower in pitch. This is basically, in real life, physically moving its phase. And if you're doing that, it's basically the same idea. And if you move the phase of something while you're playing it, it changes its pitch. However, it only changes its pitch according to how fast it's moving and in what way. And basically this works out to the idea of that we're not looking at the shape anymore of the actual waveform, we're looking at its change in slope. So a sine wave actually works like a sine wave is supposed to, because if you look at the waveform, actually let's look at a bigger one. Whoop. If you look at the waveform, you can see that its slope is always changing. So we get a tone, a motion that's always changing. And then if you look at a triangle wave, you see that we have a straight line and another straight line, which means we get a particular speed and another particular speed that are unchanging until they become the one or the other. So we get one pitch and the other pitch. And also when we look at a saw wave, we see that it's just one line the whole time, and we get a pitch, and then the clicks is when it tries its hardest to do the physically impossible thing of being in two places at once. And then the square wave, same deal, only does it twice. The reason why a square wave is actually, it's the original pitch and the saw wave is not, is because the saw wave is moving, it's still the speed, but the square wave is at, if you look at the line up here, line down there, it's not actually moving, it's just staying at that particular position, and it's at 0 degrees and 360 degrees, which is the same position, so it's just the same pitch. So if you've ever tried to use Sytrus and modulate by a saw wave or a square wave, and it just kind of sounded painful and sad, that's why. I mean, there's still things you can do with that. We'll talk about some of the cooler things you can do with sort of saw waves and square waves, but this is why the waveforms may not behave the way you expect. However, the next question you think of, at least I did when I figured this out, was okay, well, how do I get the motion that I want out of a saw wave? Because you can just do that in the analog world. You can just modulate a sine by a saw and it'll move like a saw. You can still do that. You just kind of have to get a little creative with it, and it has to do with these waveform transformation options up here. The Yamaha DX7 had a whole class of waveforms that they called the TX waveforms, and FM8 has these as well. And you'll see that when I do like this, that you kind of recognize that if you've ever used FM8 as being one of those waveforms. And what these are for are to create particular motions of movement and change in slope that elicit the kind of response we want. This particular one right here will allow us to create sort of the saw wave motion. If I were to change the polarity, it starts up, goes down, cuts, starts up, goes down, which is what a saw wave does. So like you gotta kind of get your mind into thinking about the phase relationship versus just the straight up motion. Although one thing that pops up a lot that I use in Sytrus is this whole other thing over here, which is the ring modulation tab. Ring modulation is the same idea as FM, only instead of modulating pitch, it modulates volume. There's really two sort of thoughts about ring modulation. There's straight up ring modulation, and then there's amplitude modulation. And the difference between the two is that ring modulation is bipolar. So if I have just a sine wave, it's modulating up and then down, and then the zero is zero volume. And then it goes down again and back up and negative. And amplitude modulation is just a single pole up, down, and that's the end of it. And the difference between, the biggest difference between sort of the volume side of the fast modulation versus the FM side is that the shapes are just what's happening. You don't have to worry about the phase, you have to worry about any of that. Ring modulation is just straight up what you're looking at is what you're getting. Fun fact, it's called ring modulation because the original circuit in the analog hardware that created it is just a ring. And if you're even a little bit familiar with electrical engineering, which I'm going to say right now I'm really not, it makes a little bit of sense that the ring, you send a signal through it, it just rings it around, and then yeah, it'll reduce volume, come back up, reduce volume, come back up, and it's ring modulation. I used to think it was called ring modulation because it kind of sounded ringy, but no. Turns out there's actual reasons for that. Anyway, that's the primer on FM, and you can go to my YouTube channel and watch me say that exact spiel 700 times in various videos. And of course, I'll take questions later about specifics. But let's talk about why Sytrus is even better than all of that, because everything I've just said is how every FM synth works. Every single one operates just like that. And Sytrus, the reason why I in particular feel it's superior is because it allows you to do things with that particular truth that others just do not. So first, to get this, we have to understand how the matrix works, because I fully empathize when people look at this and they think it's a little bit nuts. But there's really not a lot of better ways to think about it. This top tab, we can think of this as being the go-to. So like if we want to route something to something else, we have to start at the top here and kind of go down. So if I want to say, I want 2 to 1, I go up here and go 2 to 1, and that's 2 to 1. Or if I want to go 2 to a filter, then 2 is in the filter. So it's really just easy to kind of think of the top-down relationship. And then of course, if you want to go out, then you have to come from here to the side, and then it's just out, like so. Sytrus by default starts you off with the one oscillator, just going out. And I'm FMing something, wee. And it's a good time. Now, actually this window that we're looking at right now is one of the reasons why Sytrus is really, really powerful. And it's in this tab here, the oscillator tab. All the operators have this tab system, the various operators up here. And actually, the reason they're called operators and not oscillators is because an operator contains an oscillator, but it also has a whole bunch of other stuff. And this other stuff is what's in these tabs. You have various parameters, and then you have various methods of controlling the parameter. And then like, this is all pretty much still on par with a little bit of extra stuff from what the DX7 did. But the extra thing is this oscillator tab. And this is actually coming into additive synthesis territory, which is something that Harmor does sort of as its job. But we can still do that with Sytrus. So in here, we can engage individual harmonics of the waveform that we're using, which is an important distinction because we're not actually limited to just sine waves. If I were to engage a triangle wave and engage additional harmonics, we're actually getting triangle wave harmonics, as opposed to just sine wave harmonics. So you can create pretty wacky harmonic profiles from that, just been messing around with it. But the important thing is that whatever waveform that we create, like whatever sort of just monstrosity that I want to sort of invent here, I don't know. Come on, do something cool. There you go. And then right-click this. We have an option. You can just do the regular waveforms, and you have convert shape to sine harmonics. And it will resynthesize the waveform, the single cycle waveform, into its component harmonics at a sine waves. So like whatever waveform you want, anywhere, forever, you can just drop in there, and it will do this to it. and you can create yourself that particular waveform. So already we're like way beyond what FMA can do just for this one reason, because we have access to every waveform we could possibly think of versus just the waveforms that are just in FM8. Also, like most FM synths I can think of kind of have this particular limitation. Sytrus does not. So this is a lot of fun, and this is also way more fun when we're doing actual sort of practical FM stuff. So let's actually do a thing. One of the earliest like basses, for example, that I sort of came across that worked was the idea of FMing a sine wave by a triangle with one higher harmonic. And those of you who are familiar with my work should recognize this immediately. And this kind of blew my mind the first time I saw this. And what's happening here is that even without the higher harmonic, we have the lower harmonic. And like that half of it on the spectrum is still there. And then if I just have the higher harmonic, which I'm going to play really lightly because it's going to, you can kind of see it like showing up there. And then when I slowly introduce the lower harmonic, come on, you can kind of see it spreading a bit there, and that spread is essentially that particular harmonic being FM'd by the lower harmonic, by the fundamental tone. And in combination, it just happens to become, you know, the formant motion, which is super cool. So you can do this in pretty regular FM synths, because this is essentially just two triangle waves. It's a triangle wave that's at regular ratio, and then a triangle wave that's 4 octaves higher. And there might be a reason to separate it, but even if you didn't want to separate it, you can come in here and do, you know, all kinds of craziness to sort of spice it up. And this alone is a pretty good sort of basis to begin kind of any more complicated sound design. And like one example would be if we were to separate the higher harmonic from the fundamental in 2 entire oscillators. Now here's another neat thing that Sytrus can do in terms of modulation, because now we have two oscillators, and I haven't even like linked automation to anything. I've just been moving the matrix knobs, and you can't automate those. So but the question becomes, how do you automate FM? How do you actually change the intensity of any kind of FM? And the basic truth is that FM and how hard it's FMing is controlled by how loud the modulating operator is. So just change the volume and you're changing the FM. So if I was in operator 2, for example, and messed around with the volume knob, it alters the FM. This is also something that's true in every other FM synth. This is just, again, how FM works. Now, Sytrus has, in all the tabs, it has just a volume tab, and we can link it to one of the face X modulations up here, which I tend to do. There's also this mod tab. And the mod tab stands for input modulation. And this essentially controls every other oscillator's input into that oscillator all at once. Because I could just link volume to both of these to X together, or I can just do one time over here, and then we get a whole control of the modulation. So if you're confused about what this graph represents here, every parameter actually will have one of these articulators, and one of the articulators is the mod X and the mod Y. By default, they're all set up in such a way that whatever parameter it is, when you move the mod X and Y, it won't actually do anything, which is different for some things than others. So you see volume, it's all the way up, which means no matter where it is, it's always going to be up. And at pitch, it's right in the center, which means that no matter where it is, it's not going to go higher in pitch or lower in pitch. But the graph on the mod input here represents it saying this particular line is a 1-to-1 ratio of the X mod as it goes up. It also means that the modulation goes up. And you might be thinking, well, okay, I can see that. Why are you telling me this? And this is because you can do more than just this. I usually do this because it's pretty simple, and I like to have external modulation, but you can also kind of screw with this, and you can also just do wildly impractical things, which are always fun to do in new and interesting sound design. And that kind of stuff. So you can have really detailed like macro control of things that most synths that have macro controls that you might find out there, things like Serum or Massive, that kind of thing, that's usually linear. You link it, you have a range, and that's the end of that. But not only can we make a range, like if I wanted to be only the top end of it, I could do that. We can also do the different tension, and we can also just straight up do different, just whatever you want to have in there. This is a regular FL Studio line editor, so you can have all the various line types that are in here, and have it do whatever kind of craziness you might think you might come up with. Which will do things and all sorts of shenanigery. Single curve is usually fine, though. This is a pretty fast way of controlling the modulation of a whole lot of stuff without having to resort to individual changes. So beyond that, now that we have the separated oscillators, another cool thing that we can do is that we can daisy chain some additional FM from other oscillators, because you can do that. So for example, the higher harmonic all by itself, I can oscillate by a fundamental tone sine wave. Derp. There we go. FM in general, like you might, whenever you think of like bass sound design, you think to yourself, I want my bass to be squelchy, because maybe you want to be xCore. But this kind of squelchy is the most easily accomplished with just straight up FM. You might be thinking to yourself, okay, well, xCore uses massive pretty much all the time. So then what are you talking about? Well, the modulation oscillator inside massive is just an FM oscillator. And as we discussed before about the idea that FM is actually phase modulation, if you look at massive and you see the targets, it says, cool, we can do the ring modulation, we can also do phase. And if you modulate phase, you're modulating pitch. So that's actually just FM. And if you modulate a higher harmonic by a lower harmonic, you get pretty straight up just a squelchy business. Which is in and of itself kind of fun. But we've also done essentially one extra level of FM. So in my early days of figuring this out, a pretty common thing to do would be I'd have my operator 1 would have the mod control on mod X, and operator 3, when the higher harmonic, I'd have its mod control be mod Y. So now we have XY control, where Y controls the squelch factor, and X controls the total overall FM. You could have lots of modulation control over that kind of thing. And of course, there's only the two X and Y on there, but you can also manually automate like the volume parameters here, and it will do more or less the same thing. The volume parameter is one of those 100% to negative 100% controls, which is to say that center is actually off, and then you have positive and negative polarity, just like the knobs inside the matrix have positive and negative polarity. So that's some pretty neat stuff insofar as FM goes. Now, I have one more FM trick, which is actually pretty great for sort of modern sound design. So what we're all doing now is that we're getting pretty regular sort of like saw type harmonics. If you look at the harmonic series that in the EQ here, these first two, the fundamental and the octave above it, is one octave above it. And when that happens, that's how you know that you're getting sort of the regular harmonic series, which is what's associated with a saw wave. But a lot of modern sound design that still uses FM, like your Zomboys and the Skrillex stuff and that kind of thing, it has a lot of sort of square type stuff. It's very square and hollow sounding. And you can do that with FM very easily, even with the same configuration. And all you have to do is FM it by 1 octave more, which I'm just going to do by lowering the main oscillator by 1 octave and playing a higher note. And now you can see the series doesn't have that middle harmonic there anymore. In fact, it doesn't have any of the even number harmonics anymore, because now it has the square series. And it's done that entirely by just upping the FM by 1 octave. And like literally whatever you're doing with it, whatever FM you're throwing at it, if it's an octave higher, you'll create square harmonics. And this is, again, something that's true in every kind of FM there is. And in fact, Virtual Riot, who likes using Serum a lot, will do this in Serum. You can do FM inside Serum. You just get a wavetable, put it in there. It doesn't matter what it is. If it's an octave higher or 3 octaves higher, he likes to do that too, you'll get square bass harmonics, and it'll sound all that very good dubsteppy modern stuff, which I love. So that's a lot of fun. Now, Sytrus, really powerful FM stuff, really powerful modulation in that regard, and control of pretty much everything you'd ever want to control about FM. But it's also a really, really good basic subtractive synthesizer. And I know this because I didn't understand anything about FM for like 8 years when I was using Sytrus, and I would just use it as kind of like a really big, like a 6x oscillator, instead of using the 3x oscillator. The reason I'm bringing this up is because there's a particular thing that Harmor and Sytrus both do in their articulation, and it has to do with this tab here, the UNISON index mapping. And this is one of the more powerful things I've seen in any synth, and it's really just freakishly cool. And we're going to demonstrate how this works doing pretty basic super saw antics. It'll be great. So if I turn on UNISON, just whee, get ourselves a super saw, and go back to this UNISON tab, you might notice, oh, hey, there's more graph there. There wasn't that many as there was before. And if I come back here and reduce voices, oh, now there's 2 again. And that's because that graph, all those poles, represent one voice in the unison of whatever many voices we're using in unison. And it's essentially that particular parameter, its level can be changed per unison voice. And any parameter you're seeing that has that in there can do that. And this is the FM, this is the filters, this is like panning, and even pitch. So if you ever wanted to make like a one-note chord, you can do that without having to use every oscillator. You can just do this with one oscillator, and only this oscillator. You can unison and have a supersaw coming out of one oscillator and have something entirely unrelated to doing other oscillators, because you can actually just make your own unison profile without having to use the main controls. So you can do this by coming in here and turning off panning, turning off pitch and phase, keeping all that normal. And it sounds like a saw wave now. And if I went to, say, pitch and moved it, you can see that I'm actually now creating my own unison profile sort of in a manual sense. This is a particularly extreme one, and I'm going to draw your attention to this knob right here. Yay! This is the pitch envelope range, essentially. And by default, whenever you see a pitch tab, it'll show you +1 octave up top and -1 octave in the bottom, so a whole range of 2 octaves with yourself and regular pitch in the center. You can go all the way up to that range being 4 octaves, so 4 octaves up, 4 octaves down, or you can go all the way down where it's nothing at all. And sort of regular unison doesn't tend to spread very far. You can, of course, make it spread as far as you want, but if you want kind of regular sort of unison and to have more control over it, you want to have the pitch range be all that, it would be a little bit smaller. Or you can turn snap off and get really dainty with it. Just like super up in there. That's kind of annoying. So the pitch range thing is really helpful. And I ignored it for years and years and just kind of did really annoying stuff for a long time. So I hope to save you all of that horror. And of course, it's still doing that whole thing because we haven't gone to the phase tab yet, where we can, again, create our same control level of making our own phase profile to directly control that oscillator. So that entire supersaw is coming just from that one oscillator. I can have next to it a whole regular saw, just not doing anything. So you can have extremely complicated layering just from that and not having doing anything else. And I also mentioned that like even the FM can do this. So like if I were to say FM the saw wave by a sine wave, I can go to that mod tab, or even the volume of operator 2. In fact, let's just do the volume itself. Go to the volume, go to unison index mapping, and now we can control how deep it is per unison voice. I'm kind of keeping it even for both sides because I want the stereo spread to kind of be balanced, but you can, of course, completely ignore that and do whatever you want, just explaining why I'm doing this particular idea. And you can also do stuff like make your own comb filter. Like if I put this whole concoction into the filter and then get myself a bandpass filter, bandpass. And then go to the cutoff tab and use the unison index mapping. Cutoff tab, yeah. To be kind of around the range. There are now 9 independent bandpass filters kind of doing their own thing, which you, again, of course, have total control over. And it's really only happening as well for this one filter. So I can, again, have the other saw wave coming into this other filter. And like this kind of inner routing that you have control over in Sytrus is, again, something that other synths just don't let you do because it's kind of afraid that if you do, you'll get lost. And it's one of the things that I like about FL is that it just kind of lets you do whatever you want to do, of course, provided you know how to do it, which is why I exist, so that you know what you're doing. And that kind of goodness. And of course, this is a good time to talk about the fact that Sytrus does in fact have filters. It has 3 of them, and sort of the typical routing of filter you'll have, and if you have more than one filter, is that you got your parallel, you have your serial, and maybe some combination of the two. But just by your own routing, you can create any mix of those yourself. So every filter will have this next knob up here. And the next knob tells it to send the signal to the next filter. So if I did this and then put this into next, that means it's actually coming out of the audio filter 2 now. For whatever's happening up there. And then, of course, I could also just put the thing into filter 2, independent of that, or into filter 3, independent of that, or all of it all at once. So the filter routing is entirely up to you, and you can do things that would normally require a lot of like interconnecting, like post-processing, like mixer routing or patcher, heaven forbid. But the possibilities there are really just kind of up to you, which is why I like it the best. So I want to talk a little bit, sort of wrapping up the part where I say things to you about ring modulation on the remodulation matrix. So it does show you a wholly different matrix, but there's still just the same 6 oscillators. So like I'm FMing the saw wave by this sine wave, or that's actually just a saw wave. That explains a lot, actually. I'm FMing the saw wave by the saw wave, and that means that it's coming out of that particular oscillator. And if I engage ring modulation also from that oscillator, it'll still be doing it on the other side, and you can't really control the two of them independently. So you have to have another oscillator if you want to have separate control. And I mentioned the whole difference between straight up ring modulation and then amplitude modulation. Here's a really good example of sort of how that's supposed to work. If I were to ring modulate straight up the saw wave, it almost seems like not a lot's happening, and that's because essentially we're telling it to turn on and to turn off twice per oscillation. And really, like for the kind of applications that I want to do with it, I really just wanted to turn off and on one time. So if you engage the half mode, that's essentially turning it to do that, telling it to be a single pole action. And we can make it even sharper if we turn on the even mode, where now it's essentially like you can look at this particular oscillation. And this is essentially saying, like, you can look at this as the literal volume automation of single cycle. So we're only hearing the waveform for this 1 second, and the other half of the waveform is just silence. So we took that whole mess, that whole big phasey kind of supersaw mess, and we turned it into something rather sharp. I also want to point out that every filter has a built-in wave shaper. And you could do neat stuff with that. Anyway, pretty good about that. Who has questions about stuff?
Hello, thank you for your talk. I was wondering, I can see that FM is really useful in a broad EQ spectrum, very powerful, but can you also use it in like 1,000 to 5,000 hertz and create a translead or something, so you skip the lower part, or will it be very thin?
Actually, that's actually a really good question because of the difference between FM intensity and pitch. Because if you play, remember we said before about the fact that we're doing all this with phase, and the faster you move the phase, the higher the pitch is, like the higher the pitch changes, rather. So it means if I increase the pitch of the oscillator, it'll actually be disproportionately harder FM as a result. It won't be the same amount of FM because it's higher pitch, it's moving faster, so the intensity is higher. So if you want to make a higher pitch, like a lead using FM, you want to just use less FM because by the nature of it being way higher pitched, it's already way more intense than what you would be doing on a bass level. Any more questions?
The knobs in the matrix, what does -100 and +100 mean?
Okay. So earlier when I was demonstrating like what I would do if I wanted to make like a saw wave kind of thing, saw wave like LFO style FM, but with like regular FM. If I did this, and so this polarity means that it's going to go up, and if I wanted it to go down from up to down as opposed to down to up, then I would reverse the polarity. And so now, essentially, this oscillation, this graph is upside down now, and then that is applying itself to the motion for it to do what it's doing. So that's kind of what the positive or negative polarity does. Although, I will be honest, I usually don't pay attention to the polarity of what I'm doing, like in terms of like the oscillators and that kind of thing. Every once in a while, there'll be a really big difference, like something like this, but for the most part, it will kind of sound the same, especially if the waveform you're using is even on the top polarity and the bottom polarity, because then it's literally just the same thing, if that made sense.
Greetings, dear wizard. First thing is that, well, actually it's one question. Do you recommend Sytrus for growl bass types or combination of Harmor and, for as a, cleaner sound, less EQing? Do you recommend this one or the combination or, for making of the growl basses? Depends on the kind of growl bass, I'm sure. Actually, like, for the longest time, I didn't get how like normal stuff like filtering and distortion worked because I can accomplish really nice growl sounds using just FM by itself. Like I got really good at that before I got good at anything else. And you can do really a lot with that. And it's just kind of just different ideas on some similar things. Because Harmor can do a whole bunch of stuff that Sytrus can do. And Sytrus can do a whole bunch of stuff that Harmor can't because FM is really fundamentally different from the types of synthesis. But like if you could only have one for some reason, I would say Sytrus is probably the best bet for like
awesome, super cool, kick-ass growly stuff. But I mean, both is good too. All right, who else has questions? Person over here.
Hi. Can you also make like the Reese Basses, the hover basses with legato?
Yes.
FM synth?
Oh yeah, totally. Actually, it's really kind of easy to do that because if I FM like one thing by another thing, like this guy, and not play a super huge high note, if I use the same pitch, it's just going to be a static tone. But the second I change the pitch of any of these, it'll start to sort of self-modulate like that. And it's also the same idea for ring modulation. In fact, actually, here's a cool thing I do a lot. Yay, reset the size of the sine wave into a sine wave. That's a great idea. But I do this kind of a lot. When you have control over the individual harmonics like this, you also have control over the individual harmonics phase. So up here, it's harmonic level, and then down here is the harmonic phase. Which, by the way, if you could see, whenever I move one of these slightly out of phase, that's something that harmonic is like really apparent. And the saw wave's shape of being a saw wave is really only the case because all the harmonics start at the same phase. And the second you screw with that by, say, randomizing them, it stops being a waveform of a saw. It is still harmonically a saw. And then if I remodulate that by something sharp, but at a different pitch, it'll do that kind of self-modulation. That's kind of the style of the Reese. Yay. Anyone else have questions? Dude, way over there.
Can you show us like Sytrus in action, like in a finished song, or don't you have a project on that computer of it?
Well, we have actually in FL at large, in the demo songs folder, there's songs made by me, like this guy. Good old bass antics. How old is this song? This is like 3 years old. This is pretty old. But this song was the first song that I made when I really figured out kind of most of the things that I'm talking about FM. And so it's just lots of examples of a lot of individual things. Droop, weep. And a particularly great example of it, I think, would be the second drop over here. I'm using a lot of individual FM, and I'm also using a lot of vocoding, and I'm using the FM basses as vocoder carriers, which they're really good for as well. I'll just kind of play them, and if we have time, I'll individually go over kind of what's up. Let's start here. Hold on, wait. So on and so forth. So like this guy, for example, this bass here, FM bass 2, which is this dude? That is actually built on the exact kind of growl that I was talking about before. It has a triangle wave with the higher harmonics, some extra crap going on in the higher and like even higher harmonics. And then like it's being oscillated by a secondary FM, and then like this guy's also being oscillated by secondary FM and that kind of thing. And like these decisions, by the way, were not made with like science in mind. I was just kind of messing around with the basic idea until it sounded like something that I wanted to have. And the main controls for this are that kind of XY modulation that I showed with the secondary FM. We have the main FM is this dude, and then the Y control is controlling like the extra squelch on top of the higher harmonic. Although it's just on the whole thing because I didn't separate the fundamental with the higher harmonic. And then this is reverb, which actually comes to this guy's question that happened earlier. This is me automating the reverb to be on or off, depending on whether I want it on or off. And that's just that kind of thing. And that was actually the main sound for this whole kind of thing. And then every one of these is some variation of that. Like that sound. I'm talking about growl bass. That's what, kind of started this whole thing. In fact, like some of the earlier Skrillex sort of the sound design they made unpopular was based on this kind of stuff. He obviously did a lot of other cool things too, lots of post-processing that I'm not going to get into, but the FM foundation is really very powerful. How much time do we got left? We got one more question?
Hi. You just showed us that you could basically do everything with Sytrus. And my question is, in commercial music like dubstep, do you think that people use too less of everything? Like, do they use just a small amount of the possibilities that there are?
Yeah.
And another question for the piano roll, in the bass sound you just showed, is this, the higher notes, are those like pitch bends
Yep.
up?
Yep,
And
this is a manual vibrato with the slide notes.
do you use these very much?
Oh yeah. Slide notes are like the biggest perk about using FL. Like all the FL native plugins can take advantage of these slide notes here, which the slide notes by themselves don't make sound, but what they do is they modify the notes that they're playing. And the most obvious uses of it is something like this, where we're using it to create a vibrato kind of as long as that, so that it gets popping up really fast and coming down really fast, as opposed to slowly kind of doing it like you would normally. But along with that, before automation clips were a thing and the older FL, I would actually, because you can also move, like if you right click down here, you get various other parameters, you can slide the XY controls of Sytrus. So that's how I would do main automation before automation clips were a thing. So, and this, by the way, it only works with FL native stuff, because it's not a MIDI thing. It's a FL I don't know what thing, but it's something that's pretty indispensable for my particular process. One more question. Although, actually, I will address the first question you had about like commercial music and scratching the surface and kind of things. It's certainly true that people tend not to use the plugins to like their fullest potential and that kind of stuff. And like I certainly delve so far into things that you can't see me anymore. But that's like my choice to do that. And I don't particularly think that you have to do that to make kick-ass music. It's cool if you know what you're doing to the point where you can do something you want to do and not have to fiddle about with stuff, but plenty of really awesome tracks, and most of the most awesome tracks were done by people who have like half of an idea of what they're doing. So like, don't worry about it if this is all like so far beyond something you even care about doing.
Thank you very much.